Well, welcome everybody. So this is a special stream, and we're bringing this one exclusively live for our premium members. We want to carry on bringing value to you, and thank you for supporting XDS Spark and being a member of our family. Um, I'd like to introduce Ryan Lastimosa, who some of you may have met during your time at XDS. He was a first-time arrival at XDS this year. I met Ryan at GDS for the first time earlier this year. So GDS is the Game Development Summit in Boracay in the Philippines, and Boracay is beyond picture postcard beautiful. But it was wonderful to have a summit in the Philippines because I think it was overdue for that region. And so this year, well, next year, the summit will take place again, and once again, XDS will be hosting the main stage there. This time, the summit's going to be on between February the 5th and the 7th. And if you have the opportunity, strongly advise you to go. So, I think I just kind of wanted to start off with general introductions. I'm going to bow out of introductions because I already put my name forward. But Ryan, I'd really love to know about the very first strides you took into the games industry. What was the very first thing you did that kind of led you to games?
It's interesting, right? I did touch on my introduction into the gaming industry during my keynote speech at GDS in Boracay earlier this year. My introduction to the game development industry was a transition from working in feature film visual effects. I was contracting on the film Aeon Flux at the time, and
Oh.
I was also teaching at the Art Institute of San Francisco, and this had to have been in 2005. Yeah, 2005. That's when Call of Duty 2 came out. That was released, I believe, in the fall of 2005. I was teaching a class. I walked into the lab, and a bunch of my students pirated the game and were playing it in the school lab. And so I walked in and I asked them, like, what are you guys doing? Like, you guys are playing video games and you guys have a final due in 15 hours. What's happening? And they said, hey, this game came out. We all wanted to play it. We want to blow off some steam. We're going to pull an all-nighter. So I told them all, hey, okay, I get it. Like, you guys have been hammering pretty hard on this final. Why don't you guys just, take the next few hours and play? And by the way, like, get me a copy. I'll jump in. Right. So I started playing with them. I mopped the floor with all of my students because they didn't know I was really competitive in first-person shooters. And it was at that time when I realized that, working in film and teaching got me to a point where I needed to do something a little bit more I was more passionate about. And game development is the one thing that I realized I needed to get into. So it was that moment when I was like headshotting my students in class that I needed to get into developing games. And the first and only studio that I applied to was Infinity Ward at that time. And I was bidding for 3 different projects within the film visual effects space. I had an agent, and my agent was trying to hook me up with these different positions. But I just cold called Infinity Ward, sent over my resume and my portfolio. Nailed the interview, and the rest is history. And that game that I started working on, my first game in the game industry, was Call of Duty 4: Modern Warfare. So
that's quite an arrival. So you didn't gradually work your way up. You kind of came in right at the most popular level.
I actually thought that I would dabble in video games and then move into feature film visual effects, because feature film was my end goal, but I ended up getting there immediately after school. I think at the time, making a transition from feature film visual effects and going directly into games, it was a move that was frowned upon by a lot of my peers, because they said, why are you going into games? Film is the the thing that everyone's like embedded in. That was like where my career was at the time, and it was looked at as very risky. And this was even before Call of Duty 4 became the phenomenon, that it eventually became. But I felt like with Call of Duty 2, there was something special there. And obviously, with this type of a franchise and being able to take part in the early stages of this franchise, as it's shaped my career to where it's currently at.
Well, I mean, I'm going to rewind a little bit there because you said you worked on Eon Flux.
Yeah,
Now I'm showing my age a little bit. Eon Flux was, especially the film, was a game changer for us because I was working in comics around that time,
yeah.
and it heavily influenced what we were doing. The style was completely unusual. So, what kind of work? Because there was a series as well after the film, I think, wasn't there? Is that what you were working on, or
I worked on I worked on the film, the Charlize Theron film. Uh,
right?
yeah, so I built the opening, the city of Bregna. There was a long truck out shot. I built that whole scene with the city, and then the city pulling out, and then showing like a wide vista of the city
Mhm.
of Bregna. And then I worked on a handful of other visual effect shots all throughout the film.
So, I was around the same time. I was taking my training in 3D, and the tutor there, it was a course straddled both film and games. And the tutor there said it's harder for somebody to go from VFX into games than it is for somebody to go from games into VFX. And he had a harder time teaching VFX people how to work in games than the other way around because of VFX people were used to the luxury of virtually infinite polygons, right? We were used to the luxury of complex shaders and all the rest to get what they want, what they wanted, while the games artists were used to restriction. Did you
It's
find it that way? Did you find it the transition to be hard or?
it wasn't an easy transition coming from visual effects into games, and I've actually been asked this question a lot. Um, the biggest transition, or the biggest obstacle that I ran into was, yeah, you said it before, it's the luxury of having infinite polygons and resolution.
Hmm.
That's purely based on the fact that film is a very linear medium, right? It's a beginning to an end medium, and it goes to one perspective, right? It gets filmed, it goes to digital, it goes to actual film in some cases, but then you see something from one perspective most of the time, unless you're working on like a character or something, an asset that is very prevalent in the film, then you'll see a lot of it. In games, it's completely different, where you're you're restricted in terms of resolution. Um, you're seeing a character, you're seeing an environment inside and out. You're able to, in real time, traverse, this environment, or examine things up close. So you have to build everything from all angles. And I think the biggest obstacle I ran into was being very deliberate about where I put my resolution into things,
Mm-hmm.
specifically where the camera puts their resolution into different areas. And that's how I came upon specializing in view model first person weapons. Um,
Okay.
with view model first person weapons, I was able to utilize a lot of the skills that I picked up in film. And I was able to figure out, new and innovative ways to put that resolution into an area in a view model, so that the resolution now is very specific to where the camera is positioned on the view model, and everything else on the weapon itself would be a lower resolution, or a lower MIP rate, right? So being able to trick the eye to think that this is a very high resolution model that's in your face, it's a view model weapon. I was able to use a lot of my experience there to
To be able to do.
make the view model weapon sing. Um, so that was an example of me finding an obstacle that was very difficult at the time to overcome, and then figuring out a way to kind of you know steer that into something that became successful, with some of the games I've worked on.
So how long did you stay at Infinity Ward for?
I was there for it was just under 5 years. I think it was over 4 years. Right after we shipped Modern Warfare 2, there was a big controversy with
Hmm.
Modern Warfare 2, Infinity Ward, and Activision, and then slowly uh, people were exiting Infinity Ward, and we ended up starting up Respawn roughly
Wow.
around 2010.
Okay. So what was your first experience as a respawn like? Because it was an it was a startup, I guess, at that point.
Yeah,
Small team.
it was a startup with roughly 40 of the senior and leadership team of Infinity Ward that worked on Call of Duty 1 all the way up to Modern Warfare 2. Um, it it was a startup. Uh, we had to move fast to get things established. So we didn't really have an official office in April of 2010. Um, the landlord for the office that we were going to rent from let us squat there while the while the office was being renovated. So, we had broken glass everywhere. We had demo. Uh, but what we did was it was kind of a magical time because what we did was we went down to Costco, picked up a bunch of folding chairs, uh,
Right.
put them around in a circle. Some of us had sketchbooks, a bunch of us had laptops, and we talked about what game do we want to make.
Yeah.
And this was a clean slate from what we were developing with Call of Duty. We had to completely leave all the content, all the IP, at Activision, and then we had to start completely brand new at Respawn.
So
So
you didn't. So somebody didn't come there and arrive with right. This is a game I want us to make, and then you said about making it. It was genuinely a group blank slate of no. We have got nothing here that we're leading from. We are just going in clean.
we're going in clean. And we got everything from like everyone pitch a game, like let's take a few weeks, everyone pitch a game that you want to work on. We got everything from a side scrolling shooter to a driving game. Someone pitched a game about talking animals.
Nice. So you got.
I mean, yeah, it was completely blue sky.
Well, that's
So
very cathartic because every developer, everybody I know in video games, has the game they'd like to make somewhere percolating in the back of their brain, and to bring it all forward. I bet that was a great chance to really let their ideas kind of like come through and get it off their chest as well. This is a game I want to make. I know I've been working on Call of Duty, but I want talking animals.
yeah,
That's
we
what I
we
want.
we call it spaghetti on the wall, right? You just throw a
All
bunch of
right.
spaghetti on the wall and see what sticks. And with enough spaghetti, with enough ideas that we threw at the wall, a lot of things stuck.
Yeah.
And one of the things that stuck was giant robots.
Okay, I'm gonna go just to the slide to the side. What was the nearest miss out of those two? If it wasn't giant robots, what was the second one? What could it have been?
Ah, Command and Conquer game mechanic, right?
Right.
We so if for those who are familiar with Titanfall, um, we have giant robots, and then we have uh, these characters called pilots that pilot the Titans. We call the giant robots Titans, right? Um, we were originally going to call them operators because special operations
Mm-hmm.
operators, but we reserved that name for a combat controller that was an operator. We called that thing the eye in the sky, and that controlled a bunch of different things on the ground, from your Titan to different soldiers. And the pilot itself, we had to give that character or that different designation for a pilot, because now that's a pilot for the Titan, and we had an operator that was operating the whole area. So we had a
Yeah.
mechanic that we were working on where it was essentially a top-down RTS, like couch
Okay.
co-op type of a mechanic.
Yeah, yeah.
And the idea was, hey, if we're playing as a pilot or as a Titan, we should have somebody jump on an iPad or a laptop and be able to help us out, while we're playing on one of these
Yeah.
missions. So that got scrubbed, and
But that's interesting mechanic though.
it would have been cool, I think. Like if
Yeah.
if we had the scope, if we were able to fit that into the schedule somehow, that would have worked. We also had a single player for Titanfall 1,
Mm-hmm.
but we had to cut that due to scope as well.
Okay. So as you began to scale, then that's and the clear success is starting to come through. That's when you're starting to look at how you scale and how you do it beyond the studio, which is obviously bringing it back to the realms of external development here. As you would have almost organically, I would assume, moved towards external development as you hit those kind of barriers of scale or skill availability, resource availability. What was your first foray? What was your first encounter with bringing in external teams beyond just a contractor, beyond bringing in a specialist contractor?
We were already doing it when we were working on Modern Warfare 2. We didn't dive heavily into working with XDev when we're working on Modern Warfare 2. It was Titanfall 2 where we actually put together the pipeline to integrate external development into our process. With Titanfall 1, we were purely trying to figure out what is an MVP, what is the minimum viable product, and how do we build on top of the foundation of Titanfall 1 and ship that, right? We wanted to make sure what we were going to ship for Titanfall 1 was the condensed, most authentic version of the game. And then essentially for Titanfall 2, we just needed more, right?
Right.
Needed more. So that's when myself and a handful of other developers, on the content side, we looked into expanding our capabilities as an art department. And it, drawing from my experience in film, working with multiple vendors from external and internal, it was pretty straightforward in the fact that it was very easy for me to integrate choice external development teams and outsourcing studios into our pipeline and process. I think with Titanfall 2, it was let's start things off with a slow drip before we ship. And then once we get to ship, we ramp up our content and integration. And that seemed to have worked very well. I still think that we could have expanded a little bit faster and a little bit more in Titan while we were developing Titanfall 2. But that was like the first time we made a very serious effort to integrate external development.
Great to hear it starting from the beginning as well. That you actually went in with that in mind, so it wasn't a pressure valve that you released. It was no, this is actually going to form part of our pipeline. And so when you went into it knowing it was going to form part of your pipeline, did you build a team initially to handle that, or did the team again just organically grow as the size of your XDev started to expand?
Yeah, the team organically grew. I like to pride myself in transparency within my teams. I like to communicate everything, our objectives early on, as early as we possibly can with our teams or with the people that I work with. And one of the objectives that we had was let's make sure that we're saving some of our cycles and some of our dev time to ramp up external development. So even early on, the buy-in was there. It wasn't resistant. I mean, people weren't resistant in the art department at the time when we're developing Titanfall 2. There were a handful of other developers that they don't necessarily, they didn't at the time, they didn't understand what the process was, and they thought okay, well, who are these external teams that are coming in and doing this work for us? And once we were able to illustrate what the plan was and communicate what the objective is for this additional content that the team did not have the time to make, then that's when things started to kind of ease up, and then more resources came online in order for us to successfully integrate an outsourcing team into ours.
Were there any kind of aha moments, or any lessons that you took in during that journey as you brought more of it in, when you went, you know what, I wish I'd done this earlier, or this is something that I really felt kind of accelerated the work we're doing with our external partners.
I think the biggest aha is uh, like integrating a team into the internal team's culture and vice
Right.
versa, right? Any person that comes aboard into your development team will affect the culture in some small way. And the same applies to an external development team. Um, I think that uh, integrating an external development team into the culture of a team that I'm working with is super important because that also illustrates a lot of like cultural expectations that we
Hmm.
have within the team. And the external team, once they understand what the cultural expectations are of the internal team, then it's a lot easier to work with people. It's a lot easier to work with the objectives that we have for a specific initiative. Um, and I think like the aha moment for me is just get to know each other, right? Purely get to know each other. Who are we working with? Who are the art directors? Who are the development directors? Who's the leadership on the team? Like, we should just get as many people as we can together and interact, and sometimes not even talk about work. Not even
Yeah.
talk about art, not even talk about development. Just talk about who we are as people. And now that forms a bond. Once we have that bond, then the work usually tends just to get easier from there.
Yeah. I think
Yeah.
there's a level of comfort that you need. Because in what I find is that in the absence of communication, you tend to assume a negative. So if
Mhm.
something's quiet, you tend to assume a negative, and we have a forced negative in a lot of our interactions because of time zone and
Yeah.
just busyness, so even a gap in feedback or whatever. But you're having that breakdown, having that people to actually meet face to face allows them to maybe raise a hand or speak up a bit earlier and just go, "Are you sure about this? Are you is am I on the wrong end of the stick or whatever?" Being able to ask those questions that sometimes they don't feel comfortable in doing. But one of the points that you brought up, which I don't know if I've actually heard brought up before, was the external teams affecting the culture of the internal teams.
Mhm.
Like it being more of a two-way street because we've looked at it previously when we've looked at it has been, does the external team adapt to what your studio is and how they like to work, or do you adapt to how that studio likes to work in terms of whether it's integrated or it's more of a type brief or whatever it is? But to have a external partner really influence the culture of the internal team, that's super interesting. What can you give us any examples where you felt that the external partner had an impact, positive or negative or neutral, on the culture of your team at Respawn or others?
Yeah, here's a funny one. So we were working with an external team that I've been working with them for years, and their tech art department had a really cool tool that I wanted to integrate into our team. So I brought this it was a Maya plugin, and I brought
Yeah.
it in over to our team, and we showed it off to some of our scripters internally at Respawn, and they at first were very apprehensive, like why are you bringing external code? And it's like, well, it's this thing that we really need, right? It'll
Yeah.
speed us up. Uh, so it was a lot of like political back and forth to get some of this tech integrated, and it wasn't even like a huge like script. It was just something that would speed up our process. um, that right there was a thing where now we were much more integrated with this external development team, because now the art department had the trust of the engineering team, and then the engineering team had the trust of the art department, and then now we had the trust of this external development team to integrate code and actually help us out with our development process. And this was also a cultural thing that we had to take a hard look at, because um, just because we've been doing something for so long and it works doesn't mean we're doing it the right way.
Yeah.
And it forced us to ask the question internally, within the art department and within the engineering department, because we're so resistant to this one particular tool, does this mean that we're even doing things right? Like, we need to look at this and realize, like, why are we so hesitant in bringing this tool aboard? And the external team just gave it to us. They said, hey, we love working with you guys. It's like, yeah, we love working with you guys too. Let's, this is going to help us. Um, so we validated it, we integrated it into our pipeline, and then, we kept moving along. And that was an example of, us being open to being taught a better way to do things. And with an external team, a lot of external teams are working on multiple projects all the time. They're working with different pipelines. They're working with sometimes like, the worst, but sometimes the best practices. And those are the things that I want to make sure that my teams are open to. We're open to changing the way we do things, because if we want to be much more efficient in what we do, we have to listen to the people that are experts.
And it's honestly, it's music to my ears. 'Cause I think it's an area of incredible untapped potential. And
Oh,
just as you've described, we
absolutely.
don't,
Yeah,
our external partners work with the best and work with the worst. And I kind of forget that there's an awful lot of lessons to be had from the bad experiences, and to not tap into it, but also to find yourself so resistant to bringing in something that's on the lower risk end of that scale, I assume, into the pipeline just because of that. And I don't think it's I don't think it's a unique experience at all. I think we we are slow in improving our production practices, and we are slow in leveraging the kind of experiences our external partners have.
it brings it back, for me, to culture, right? Culture is a huge part of this. I think, our team's culture really reflects on the product that we create, and that team's culture, again, it's the kind of connective tissue that ensures an efficient pipeline, and also a pleasurable pipeline where you want to
Yeah.
enjoy like the work that you're doing. But one of the big things that I've always strayed away from internally on our team and also externally is to completely eliminate, or as much as I can, try to eliminate the notion of us versus them.
Mhm.
Like, there's always been this notion of you're a developer that's on the line, and it's like, oh, that lead or that supervisor or that manager, it's always like us versus them. um, some of that is okay, but when it comes to one department versus another department, then you're dancing with
Mhm.
the devil, right? If you're talking about the internal team, and now the internal team is talking about an external team, and then you're making those, uh, negative assumptions, that needs to be like completely abolished from the very beginning, or it needs to be addressed. Because
Mhm.
once you start getting into the habit of, let's throw this work over the fence, and then, in 12 hours time, we're going to get the work back, like, we're already putting ourselves into that position of, let's just stick this thing in the oven and just like expect it back, right? There's no communication going on. You know, um, there's no level of expectation that will get us to a point where now that doesn't become toxic, right? Eventually, if you let that run long enough, it will eventually become a toxic type of an environment. So being able to communicate as much as you possibly can, with that external team, and also communicating internally, it's not us versus them. It's, let's figure out what's happening here. Let's communicate. Let's make sure that we understand the whole situation, and then address it, right? Because we don't want to make sure that this type of thing where there's this whole gap in communication, it can't go too long. We need to make sure that we're constantly uh, lockstep in our objectives.
And there's communication in action. That's what I really liked in about your story, is the fact that they put something in that contributed to production that was outside of there. That something that is a form of communication, because it's a physical manifestation of trust. So you're basically saying we are all part, we're all working towards it together. And your point about the gradual breakdown, if it's constantly if that kind of integration isn't happening over a long period of time, I can completely see as well,
Yeah.
because it gradually builds up like plaque, the lack of that communication,
Yeah.
the feedback.
And it's a two-way street, right?
Yeah,
External development teams can also say the same thing about development teams.
yeah.
And, you know, it's that separation of not knowing or not understanding that there's a human on the other side of that email or of that Slack message, right? Like once you abolish that notion that it's just something that you throw something into the void and there's an actual person on the other side, then once you're immediately thinking like, okay, this person knows me, I know that person, like now all of a sudden there's a connection there, and then now I can actually be civil and professional and
about it.
want to work with this person as opposed to just throwing something over the fence.
And what I think one of the COVID, oddly enough, did an awful lot of good for external development. In that it broke down a lot of barriers. Suddenly, everybody was working remote. Everyone understood the challenges of working remote. Um, but one of the things I think it also did is it took it almost too far, whereby it became harder for us to justify going out and actually seeing our external partners on site because everything can be done remote. So why would we then go and go on site? And I think the justification could be quite difficult pre-COVID. Post-COVID, I think it got even harder. And the anecdotal evidence I see from external partners is that they have fewer on sites from their teams. And I'm sure there's budgetary problems in there as well, but there's real value. Have you seen, how would you describe or how do you position that kind of value to the people who can sign the check for you to actually get on a plane and go out and see them?
It's a tough one, right? Because when it comes to leadership teams, um, you want leaders that understand the process, but also understand the value of the unseen metric of what a successful team, how a successful team operates, right? Because you can't necessarily track a metric or put it on a team and say, hey, this team is very effective at what they do because of all of their check-ins. You want to be able to somehow show leadership that there's a good flow, that people can jive together. And if leadership is keen to understanding like the actual human connection between external and internal, that's much easier, but it's so much harder when you have someone who's like steps removed from the process and they have to sign
Mhm.
a check.
Yeah.
That's difficult. That is very hard. um, I really think exposure is like the best possible way. I mean, if
Mm.
exposure is putting together a slide deck and just showing, hey, this is how we communicate. This is how much more effective we are with our deliveries, with our check-ins. This is how much money that we're saving. Speaking that language actually gets people to perk up and say, okay, this is worth it. And
Okay.
it's such a broad question with many broad answers because there isn't necessarily really the right answer. It really depends on what kind of a organization are you working for? You have to speak the language of that particular organization to be successful.
Yeah, it's yeah, it's not something I found it's not a lock I found a key necessarily for. But
It
it's
takes
every
us.
single time I have never come back from a trip to see somebody on site and people come back and go, well, that was a waste of time.
Hmm,
That's
absolutely.
never happened.
Yeah,
It's never
and
happened.
it takes a specific type of a person to be that kind of connective tissue and take the initiative to take those steps to communicate, to ensure communication is working smoothly.
So one thing you were new at was it was your first XDS.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that
So
was that was
you came in as a an experienced newbie to
yeah.
um
Yeah.
to XDS, and I'm really curious to get your kind of first impressions, your kind of overall impressions of what the event is like. Because I mean, you're somebody who has spent enough time on the conference circuit as well. So what were your initial impressions of the event?
It in some ways it felt like a high school reunion. In some ways, it was just a lot of people I've worked with in the past that were
Yeah,
all collected in one place. I think overall, the experience at XDS as a developer, it it was amazing. I had a blast. I had a really good time, reconnecting with you guys, reconnecting with a bunch of old friends, and then making some new ones. But the
yeah,
whole format of being able to reach out and connect with people, and putting people into this direct vicinity where they can make these connections, and even just chat with people at different restaurants or at different, like, bars having a drink. I think just providing that platform for people to connect is the thing that is my biggest takeaway from
Hmm.
XDS. It was the ability to be within the proximity of other people that were like-minded, um, and just the ability to connect with people and make a bunch of new friends. Right? It's that platform is that was the most important thing for me.
And it's odd enough, one of my biggest regrets from this XDS. I filled my calendar to the brim,
Yeah,
and I didn't leave enough room for just wandering around,
yeah.
and for just there were social occasions that I didn't get the most out of. I think there was I it really highlighted the value of some of those of that downtime, of that medium time, of the those kind of areas. And I think I actually met less people as a result of setting more meetings, if that
Mm,
makes sense.
that makes total sense. And for some of the people on this call, I apologize if I declined any of your invites, because I had to go through a process of validating, who would we have to work with, right? Anyone that would reach out to me on the portal, if it wasn't a type of thing where I could validate, like, working with that group in the future, then I had to respectfully decline meeting them. But that also, to your point, it left things open for me just to wander and just
Hmm.
to run into people and have those meetings of happenstance, which eventually led to much more talks.
Yeah.
Um, but I think, like, having those mixers, having those events where um, meeting random people was actually the objective.
Yeah.
That was part of the objective of me attending XCS, was who am I going to meet? Like, I don't know yet. We'll figure out who's there.
Which is it's a very nice way to go in. I think a lot of these conferences, especially when I look at some of the larger ones, you with having that many people in one space and it's so concentrated, and for such a concentrated period of time, you tend to come away with an impression, like
Mhm.
something that's happening in the industry, a movement or a shift or a feeling or whatever. When you get that mass of people in that kind of all in one area together, when you came away from XDS, was there like a general impression of either a movement or a direction that the industry was taking, especially with regard to external development?
I think, in regard to external development and where the industry is currently heading, and the feeling that I got from XCS and from the industry overall, is that we're in tough times right now, right? Things are rough. Uh, we don't have a lot of risks being taken by publishers and by investors. Um, there are a lot of things that are happening that are just flat out disheartening. We
Hmm.
have situations like uh, what's going on with Concord, right? It's a horrible situation. We have all of these amazing AAA developers that for any particular reason, the end product of what they created didn't exactly land the way that it was expected. And with everything happening in the industry currently, like that was just something that illustrated much more how much risk is involved in this industry. And I think the feeling that I got from XDS and from external development and from the other developers that were there was, let's band together, let's tie our boats together. Let's see what
Hmm.
can we do together now, in person, where we can somehow tie these boats together and ensure that the rising tide raises all boats.
Hmm.
And that was very comforting, to
Hmm.
see just people getting together and figuring out different ways to survive until 25.
Yeah,
Um,
I
and
think it.
yeah, go ahead.
No, I had this theory.
Yeah.
So in the early XDSs, the atmosphere of XDS has always been really cooperative, has always been super friendly, it's been energetic, and I've always loved it for that. But there's also a niggling part of my brain that was going, yes, but times are good. Like for many, many years, like there's a lot of work going around. So when we have all these competitors in one place, it's not like a Shark Tank because actually there's quite a bit of work.
Yeah.
So it's okay.
Yeah.
This last year, and the year before, or this last year particularly, was the first time. Well, actually, no, there's not. There are. It is a tough time. There is less work to go around. There is much more competition. And you know what? The atmosphere was still friendly. The atmosphere was still cooperative. The atmosphere was still very, very supportive. And so it was like a litmus test validation. It made me extremely happy, to be honest, to see that actually this wasn't a skin deep thing. This wasn't something that was just on the surface. This was no, we are genuinely a supportive community, which was wonderful to see.
Genuinely a supportive community, and that was very evident from attending XDS in Vancouver. And to that point as well, us being in a very difficult time, in this industry, uh, there was a conversation that you and I had in the Philippines at GDS in Boracay, where we were talking about the struggle of game development, what we've seen throughout the years, like the ups and downs, the ebbs and the flows. And the conversation that you and I had with a group of other people over a drink, we were talking about where are we headed as an industry. And you brought up an excellent point that I've echoed, to other friends in the industry to this day. And it's we are on the precipice of a golden age.
I
We're
hope
on
so.
yeah, and I I feel it. I know that it's there because this is how magic happens. Once you start to take away all of these things that make life easy for us, we have to figure out a more creative way to do things. We have to be the ingenuity bubbles up to the surface, and it sucks where we're currently at, in the industry. But my hope and my optimism is rooted in that simple fact that we're on the precipice of something that is going to be a major change in our industry.
I certainly hope so. I mean, I think that's a very good place to start taking questions from, actually, Ryan, because I think that's a lovely point to close out on.
Yeah,
And I agree. I think we are, but I will. I say to close out, and then now I'm just going to jump in with something else, which is just that to your earlier point about the fact that the external suppliers have seen the best and the worst. So as we're on the edge of this precipice, we have this mass pool of knowledge from our external suppliers. And I think we're going to need to pull upon that to find out exactly how we do the best and how we avoid the worst to tip ourselves into that golden age and find those new ways of doing it. I think that's where the resources are going to lie. That's where the path is going to lie.
absolutely.
Well, Chris is telling me that we've got a couple of questions in here now. I don't want anybody I don't want us to run out of time before we get our question from our premium members. So, Chris, could you like
Yeah.
to
Yeah,
hop on in?
thanks, Sam, and thanks, Ryan, for a very enlightening conversation. We all appreciate it. First question actually is from Vladimir. He was wondering if you're hoping to get back to the Philippines for Game Dev Summit next year. And I will add to that question and ask, what was your general impression of GDS in terms of a conference that's the first of its kind to bring all sorts of developers and service providers together from Southeast Asia?
I would like to. I'm currently looking at taking plans so I can make that trip again in February of next year. It's very special to me because me being Filipino American, it's a chance for me to reconnect, with my heritage, but also bring some of the business here in the States over to that region, which is exposure from Southeast Asia to the game development industry in the West it just needs to be that needs to happen more, right? That connection needs to happen more. Yeah, I will try as much as I can to get to GDS. I can't guarantee that I'll be there, but I'm trying as hard as I can to actually get there, depending on scheduling. And overall, my impression of GDS in Boracay, it was an amazing experience because, again, it was a more condensed version of XDS. I feel like it was a much smaller, more intimate connection with some of the developers that were there and some of the external developers that attended. And the setting overall, just being in Paradise, was very relaxing. It put people at ease, and it was much easier for people to reach out and communicate and just chat and introduce themselves. I think at XDS, it's a lot of it is go go go, which is good in a lot of ways. But with GDS, it was more like, okay, like who's getting coffee, right? Who's going for a swim, right? Like that's the type of connection that I thrive on. That's the connection that I love. And yeah, overall, like they're two different experiences, right, with GDS and XDS. I think GDS is something that should not be missed, for sure.
That's a great endorsement. Thanks, Ryan. Next question is from Stefan. Ryan, you mentioned getting hit up a great deal for meetings at XDS. In your opinion, how can we as partners be most effective in capturing your attention in order to score a meeting? In other words, how can we put our best foot forward?
Yeah, this is a tough one because I know, when it comes to business development, it's, make the connection. It's, like establish those comms early on. I think for me, what works for me in particular is when someone does the research as to what the content that we're creating is or what the job is that we're looking for. If we're not at the stage where a particular discipline in development isn't needed at the time, then that's when like I'll have to respectfully decline a meeting. I think finding something on a personal note where if you reach out to a developer or reach out to myself and say, hey, I've noticed that you've done this type of a game in the past, these are the types of services I can offer, right? That's the type of thing that gets me to say, oh, okay, cool. Like maybe we should talk. Like maybe we don't need a partnership right now, but maybe like, a few months from now, we could maybe move into that. I think that's a first step.
Okay. I mean, I think XDS has its own character and its own way of doing things. I've a little bit of advice just to build on what you were saying there is I do find that developers are more open to setting meetings earlier on when they're not playing calendar Tetris.
Yeah.
The harder it gets, I find that they can't do it. I know with this time around, there was an awful lot of requests received. I think that developers can't necessarily give a message to each one of the meetings they decline. But the chances are that they do want to meet with an awful lot of the people that they end up declining just because of sheer time. So it may not be. That's why the socials are so important, because it may well be, oh, great, I did want to grab a couple of minutes with you if I could, but I just couldn't prioritize it over the meetings we had in place.
Outside of the portal, between LinkedIn and email, and even, some connections on Facebook, right? Like those are some ways that I connected with people at XDS and at GDS. So this also touches on, the same type of response where it's, if you figure out a way to communicate or to break the ice, with someone like myself, then, take it. And it's not just through the portal, right? And it's also not just through LinkedIn. It's finding a common thread that we can align on and that we have something of a common interest, right? That's a good way to break the ice.
Yeah, I'd agree. Well, with that, I would like to say huge thanks, Ryan. It's always a treat and a pleasure to catch up with you.
Likewise.
And remembering to say like and subscribe to LinkedIn and to our YouTube channels to pick up on this and other webinars. We will carry on producing content to help bring our community together and help support as we go through surviving, maybe even thriving in 2025. Who knows? Let's keep the optimism up. But certainly for keeping our community stronger. So with that, I'd like to say a big thanks to everyone. A big thanks as well to Chris for managing the boards. All the best and take care, everybody.
All right. Thank you all.
Cheers.
Take care.